our culture will tell you a certain narrative, a certain playbook about what it takes to be successful. And there's truth in all of that. But what I've found is largely there is an alternative path that actually is better, fundamentally better. And it's something that I've seen throughout the course of my career, both through making mistakes and taking some positive steps as well. And so that's really what I want to share with you tonight. But I always thought, as you're thinking about these kinds of things, especially if you're from Silicon Valley, you have to have an origin story, right? I mean, the origin story is a huge part of your narrative. And so, I don't know, when you think about Silicon Valley, leaders and their origin stories, I'm not sure what image comes to mind. I mean, it might be, a couple of guys in a garage in Palo Alto with a crazy dream that computing ought to be something that every one of us can interact with. This is certainly who it was for me growing up. And watching, guys like this who challenged the status quo and thought differently and changed the world, and see what a profound impact that had, not just on the industry, but even in terms of what it means to be a leader and shaping what Silicon Valley is. Maybe your view of that is more like this guy, right? Who, for him, it was a dorm room at Harvard, and thinking entirely different ways about what if, and having these giant dreams. So my origin story is a little bit different than that. There was no garage involved. There was no dorm room involved, although I had great times and experiences in my dorm rooms here. But for me, it goes back a little further than that, to a wonderful little town, delightful place called Kingman, Arizona. Anybody here ever been to Kingman? So we got a few. How many of you that raised your hands had your car break down there? That's usually one of the, it's exactly. So this is the thriving downtown metropolis of Kingman, Arizona, circa my youth, okay? Now, if you haven't been to Kingman, it is in the song Route 66, Kingman, Arizona. So it has, if you've seen the movie Cars, the Interstate I-40 coming through, like that's kind of the town I grew up in. But also has another distinction that I think is a mark of honor for me. It's certainly going to be on, my autobiography book jacket whenever that is written. And that is that a couple years ago, there was actually a survey across the U.S., and Kingman was recognized as the least educated town in all of America. Just let that sink in for a bit. So this is based on percentage of residents that have any kind of education whatsoever. So this is where I hail from. This is where all of the vibrant, business ideas and dreams were born in the mind of a kid who looked at this around him and said, I think I want to do something different. I do want to mention though that even in spite of that surrounding, I was already thinking tech, all right? So this is the day when the Apple II had just come out. We were just, experiencing the joys of computing for the first time and banging on these things, and you could just get in and start programming and just learning stuff. So actually my good friend David and I formed a company called Elysium Software back in 79, 80, 81, somewhere in that time frame. And our product was actually designed for automotive dealers and helping them price automotive. This tells you what kind of a strange kid I was back in high school. It wasn't a game, it wasn't anything, wasn't a social network. But I will give myself some credit here. Recognize this is in 1980 or so, long before the internet exists, and the hand-drawn logo is a cloud. That has to stand for something, right? I get the vision or. So anyway, we had a lot of fun, learned through those kind of processes. Then I went from there directly to Biola, enrolled here as a business student with the goal of sort of learning the fundamentals to go off and build a career in business and ultimately in technology. Now, the 80s was a fabulous time to study. Remember those of you who have some context for the 80s, it was a time when Magic was MVP, when Michael was king of pop, and when our friend Gary here had rock star hair that we all envied and wished we were more like him. But it was a fabulous time of craziness, innovation, and that's the context that I came out of. Now, transitioning from there with a degree under my belt and wanting to go off and all the big bright-eyed dreams of changing the world into Silicon Valley very shortly thereafter. And I don't know what your view of Silicon Valley is. Maybe it's from the HBO show. Maybe it's from clips you see on YouTube. Maybe it's guys like this, these iconic visionaries. My entry into Silicon Valley was a bit different. Okay, so the first company I worked for up there was a company called McAfee. Right, and most of you have heard or know this is the security antivirus company, and great company, smart people, all those kinds of things were there. And so from that perspective, it was a great place to jump in and just be allowed to experiment, try new things, innovate, learn from smart people. Immediately on my second week at the company, being in meetings with the CEO and sort of, really jumping in the deep end. But it was also jumping in the deep end in a whole range of things that I had not quite prepared for and didn't expect. Just for context, for those of you who don't know the backstory of McAfee, and this is not atypical for Silicon Valley, certainly in that era, but I think you find this pattern repeated over and over in many businesses around the world. This is the founder of McAfee, a gentleman named John McAfee, very distinguished, as you can tell by his pajamas there. This is actually from a video clip. I do not actually encourage you to go and download these and watch them, but these are video clips he made after he left the company. In this particular one, he's snorting lines of Coke with $100 bills handed to him by hookers. That's kind of the background and context for what you didn't know this was going to be a PG-13 talk, did you? But this is the kind of culture that was created. Now, just again for a little more context on what Mr. McAfee was like, they've announced recently they're going to make a movie of a very interesting incident in his life that happened well after he left the company, and they've cast Johnny Depp to play him. Now, just a word for you. Anytime they cast Johnny Depp to play you in a movie, and everybody who knows you thinks, I'm not sure he's crazy enough to portray you, it's a problem. And that's kind of the culture that McAfee was built on. And that kind of culture, when you have that at the top, it permeates everything in the company. Now, the time I joined, John had just left, and they brought in a gentleman named Bill Larson, who was the adult supervision, as you can tell, very sophisticated, talented senior executive. But the culture didn't change. Bill's entire motto was drive fast, take chances. Everything about him was encouraging us to push the limits of ethics and morals and all that in pursuit of making the company great and earning profits and those things. So all the stuff, the bad stuff that all you in the room get sort of cast in when you pursue careers in business. And I saw it around me every single day. Just as a little example, this was one of the ads, a little clip from one of the ads that we ran during the time I was there and as a young guy in the marketing department. Now, for those of you who haven't seen the movie Basic Instinct, I don't, necessarily, was it Basic Instinct? With Sharon Stone? Yeah, right. So there's some interesting things that happen in the film regarding camera angles and lack of clothing that were hinted at very profoundly this is an ad that runs on broadcast TV. And just to give you an example of that, this is what the kind of decision that corporate makes, right? And then how that trickles down through the culture of the company. So very shortly after that, I happened to be in Europe supporting some of our European sales team and discovered as I'm working with some of our customers there, the lovely Christmas Advent calendar that our regional marketing team in Europe had made for all of our customers and passed it out. So this is a photograph of it. This is a, multi-million-dollar professional company handing this out to customers as a Merry Christmas welcome gift. That's the kind of culture it was. And for me, this is all I know of business at this point. And trying to, at that point, figure out how do you navigate being successful as a business leader, keeping your integrity strong, but actually be successful in this environment. And is it possible? And I'll have to tell you, there were moments in that journey when I saw what was happening around me, when I saw the kind of leaders that we see in the press succeeding and sort of the persona, the way they acted. And I asked myself, is it even possible to be highly successful in a business culture and still maintain the things that I wanted to believe were my core values? And I think what I want to do in the next few minutes here is just share 5 or 6 observations of what I have seen over my career where the conventional wisdom says one thing, and I've learned that while there's some truths in it, that the opposite is actually a far more powerful and successful point. I hope it's an encouragement to you. First one I want to mention is that conventional wisdom, and you hear this all the time in various words, that success is a zero-sum game, meaning essentially that for you to win, somebody else has to lose. The pie is a certain size. Everything is about competition. And believe me, I love competition. I think it's the most one of the most fabulous ways to drive innovation in a market, to serve customers and all of that. But that mindset that everything I do, negotiations, working with employees, with partners, with customers, everything is about, am I going to win and are you going to lose? Now, I don't know if you recognize what's on the picture there. Anybody know what those are? Yeah, so the legend of these samurais, this was actually on the wall in Bill Larson's office during the time I was at McAfee, right? He's got the 2 swords. And if you know the sort of mythology or the purpose behind these, the long sword is for your enemy, and the short sword is for yourself if you fail. So every time you walk into the CEO's office, this is what's staring you in the face saying, you know, this is how we run the company. This is the mindset. This is the mentality. This is what I want all of you to adopt. In fact, an interesting story, if I'd heard this story actually before I joined, I don't know if I would have actually pursued the job. So I come in and was told that a week before, Bill and one of the senior executives of the company were having an argument in his office. The way the office is set up, you know, his office in the corner, there's a quadrant of the office that's all the sales folks with cubes, you know, so they all kind of see across each other. And the other executive is having an argument with him about the role that he should play. Wanted a president role, you know, that type of thing. So this thing's getting louder, heated debate, to the point where all the sales reps are now, you know, phones off, kind of crouched down in their cube, watching, listening, you know, what's going to happen. And they said that at some moment, the door of the office burst open, and Rick, the other executive, comes running out, and Bill is chasing him with the long sword, dropping F-bombs, swinging out, chases him out of the company. All right, so again, but that is the ethos that you see over and over and over again. Of course, fortunately, not every company is like that, but that subtle mindset that says everything we do, if we want to succeed, somebody else has to lose. And I want to tell you, I've found that certainly there are some truths in that, but I think the opposite is more true. I think the opposite is more profound and can lead to stronger success. That if you want to be successful, your primary focus should be on how do I make those around me successful. And I got to tell you, just in my experience, that sounds counterintuitive, but when you take that mindset, when every engagement with an employee, with a boss, with a partner, with a customer, when they can tell that your primary goal is, what do you need? How can I make you successful? How can I invest in you? You build a set of fans that will carry you much further than the battles and the swords and all of the other antagonistic attitude. There's a fascinating book, if you haven't ever read it. You guys know who Adam Grant is? If you haven't read Adam Grant's stuff, and he wrote Originals, fabulous book. But one of Adam Grant's first book, he's the professor at Wharton, best-selling author now, and repeatedly voted the top professor at Wharton by students. So, you know, an elite in sort of MBA circles. And his first book was actually called Give and Take. And he tackled that topic. His core thesis, the question he went out to ask was, in business and in life, there are sort of givers, people who are naturally oriented toward that kind of mindset of I want to invest in others, I want to give. There are takers, right, who are always, I want to make sure I win, and for me to win, you got to lose. And then there's most of us in the center who are kind of that quid pro quo. I'll invest time in you, do a favor for you if I think you have something to offer for me. You know, I owe you one, buddy. All that kind of stuff, that's where most of us live our day-to-day. And so he asked this really interesting question as a sociologist and a business leader. What ultimately does the data say leads to more success? Now, I'll let you read the book because it's full of fabulous anecdotes and really interesting data, but there's a really interesting, profound theme and thread to the book, and it looks something like this. So in the beginning, in many of these studies, whether they're looking at medical students or business leaders or whatever, in the beginning stages, you'll typically find the takers and the matchers perform better in whatever metric is being measured. Grades, salary level, advancement in your career, whatever. And the givers tend to be a little bit lower. And then over time, you start to see this happen, right? And a big part of the reason there is that the givers, who are they giving to? They're giving to the people on top, right? They're investing in those people's lives. And then as their careers advance, as they get into other situations, again, they've built such a huge fan base around them, people who say, that person is a great person. Like, they helped me when I needed it. I want to see them succeed, and that ultimately lifts them to broader success. Now, this is an overly simplified chart. There's a lot of rich data in the book, but I've seen that thing happen over and over again in my career. Another wonderful book that came out a number of years ago, Jim Collins' Good to Great. For those of you who are not familiar with the book or haven't read it, what Collins did at the time with a number of his graduate students is he looked at the performance of publicly traded companies. And he looked at them across, companies that were successful over long periods of time. Not a year of success, but 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, sustained success. And then dug into the data to ask the question, what are the core characteristics of the companies and the men and women who lead them, and can we learn anything from that? Now, out of that research came 5 key characteristics that came up repeatedly in the DNA, in the behavior of leaders of these great companies, the ones that were continuously outperformed the market. We're talking about stock market, like all the financial metrics. And most of them were things that you might expect. There's one on that list that just blew us all away when we read this for the first time, and it was humility. So all that mindset we had of you have to be the jerk, you have to rip people to shreds, you have to have that sort of aggressive persona, you need to maybe chase a few people with swords every once in a while to show who's boss. And the reality is that over time, this is what repeatedly comes up as a hallmark characteristic of leaders that led to not popularity surveys, financial success, market success, stock market growth, growth and success with customers. Absolutely, I've seen this over and over in my career, and I think all the data repeatedly bears this out. In fact, another really interesting sort of study that came out about the same time is a comparison of the size of a CEO's photo in the annual report with the subsequent earnings and market success, and found that, interestingly enough, there's actually an inverse relationship. This over here, if you might recognize, is Mr. Ken Lay. If you don't know who he is, go Google him. But interesting again, when you see that hubris, that need to put themselves out front, that need to be this larger-than-life character, very often you see the opposite of what you would expect. So an encouragement from me to you on this first one is that you're going to see over and over again these kinds of narratives. You're going to see examples. You're going to hear about it from those around you that says you have to be a certain way to be successful, and you can't be that wallflower. And I don't mean being a wallflower. What I mean is acting in a way that is consistent with the values I think we all have, and looking at others first. So next one. Conventional wisdom is that those who fail should be fired. Notice I put Mr. Trump in here in a completely non-political context, which I think should deserve some honor itself. But we certainly have this expectation, both kind of in life, the leaders we admire, and we assume that if you want to run an excellent business, you have to hold people accountable, right? And if people are not performing, put them out of the way. Now, again, all of these conventional wisdoms have a core element of truth. Absolutely agree that you want to be able to make sure people can succeed, and if someone's a wrong fit, make the decision quickly, move on. All those kinds of things are true. But that mindset of running that kind of organization, I think, is entirely counterproductive. In fact, what I think is a far better mantra that I've seen throughout my career is that failure has to be safe. And if failure is not an option, then neither is success. So let that sink in for a minute. If you do not create an environment where everybody in your organization knows that failure is safe, and in fact, dare I say, celebrated at times, you will never succeed in the big picture innovation kinds of things, because people don't innovate in little boxes where they're operating out of fear. And all that hubris, that desire to push for excellence that says, instill that fear, and like, yeah, of course you have to have pursuit of excellence. But you have to be really cautious of this. A couple interesting stories. I don't know if you guys have heard this story before. If you've read Creativity, Inc. by Ed Catmull, about the founding of Pixar and sort of that whole story, he tells a wonderful story about the creation of Toy Story 2. It's about this time, if you remember the sort of that time period, Toy Story had been this blowout success for the company. They're the darling of Hollywood, of Wall Street. And Toy Story 2 is going to be this new epic thing that's going to take the company to the next level. So there was a point in the production of Toy Story 2 where they're almost at the final stages of the product, right, of the film. And they're standing in the room, sort of watching the big screens as the animators are working on assembling pieces. And they're sort of noticing all of a sudden Woody's hat's disappearing and Buzz's, gun is disappearing. Stuff's happening in the video. Like and people realize pretty quickly things are being erased from our core servers. Like these objects in the animation are being erased. Something's wrong. So they immediately call down to the server room, tell them like, pull a plug, stop the servers, something's going on. They stop it. Unfortunately, about 80-some% of the movie had been completely erased. And they go, well, that's fine. I mean, obviously, a company like Pixar has, backups and all this sort of thing. So they go back to their backup systems and discover that the backup had failed a while back and wasn't operating correctly, and there were no backups. So now they're sitting there literally panicked. What are we going to do? The company's over, and for something that's so utterly stupid that probably our careers are over. And then in that process, somebody remembers, that one key person on the project who left for maternity leave partway through the project? We actually signed a release form that allowed her to take a server home with her so she could work on it from home, right? Call her and find out. So they check this out, and she's like, yeah, I still got this little server running in my bedroom somewhere behind a shoebox or whatever. I think it's still there. So the executives from Pixar rush down to her house, and they describe the scene of coming back, like holding this thing like it's this precious Fabergé egg or something, taking it back to the office, and everything is restored. Here's the punchline of the story. When it was all done, and Ed is leading the charge, every instinct from most of your management books would say, find the employee who made that error, make an example of them, make sure this never happens again. And he said, I made a decision at that point. I was not going to ask who did it. Everybody in the company was aware of what a crisis situation this was. We made the changes necessary to create a more resilient system, and we very clearly sent a message to the company that we want you to do things like you're doing. Failure is safe here. There's even little interesting stories when you look back at the early days of Facebook. Facebook's motto in the early days was try stuff, break stuff kind of mentality, right? And there was an early story where one of their key engineers is testing things to see what breaks the site, and inadvertently is successful and shuts down all of Facebook. Like, bad problem, right? So when they recover from this, Mark Zuckerberg brings the team together. They fix the problem. Of course, this is all over the press. This is not like something you just hide behind the scenes on. And he said, not only did he not fire the guy, he said, okay, obviously you have done us a great service by showing a problem in our systems that makes it hard for engineers to test things, which we want you to do. He said, I'm gonna call you out and celebrate you. He called the whole company together and said, this is the kind of heroic engineering we need. We need people who are willing to push the envelope, who are willing to break things. He showed us something super important. And by the way, they actually named the new testing methodology to avoid those in the future after the engineer who did that. So again, to me, I see stories like that, and I think that's a far more profound way of leadership, style of leadership, that is rooted in integrity, rooted in appreciation for those around you, rooted in a very different kind of mentality, and I think it leads to more success. And I've certainly seen it throughout my career. Another key conventional wisdom is, and again, all these things there's truth in it, but you hear this all the time, work with people you like and who share your perspective, right? Who could argue with that? Like, life is short. And certainly you want to have people around you that share your values, share integrity and all that. But let me offer something slightly different that I think actually is perhaps more likely to lead to the kind of success that we all want. Work with people who challenge you with different perspectives, even when it's uncomfortable. Okay? I didn't say people that have entirely different values, but people who approach things in ways that you don't. Really, really interesting things. And I can tell you lots of stories from my own career, but a couple things that I want to kind of leave you with here. I know any of you have read any of Walter Isaacson's books. He's the one who wrote the iconic biography of Steve Jobs and Einstein and several others. But Isaacson wrote a fabulous book a few years ago called The Innovators. The Innovators looks at the narrative arc of computing industry from like Ada Lovelace back in the 1800s to modern times. And the origin of this book, he was having a conversation with Bill Gates about what's my next biography? Who's the next great iconic leader in technology they ought to write about? And Gates says to him, your books are good. I love that. That's all good. But that's not really the way innovation happens in technology and frankly in business. The way really innovation happens, if you look back at the key breakthroughs, the things that utterly changed the game, it's when you had teams that come together with very diverse perspectives. It was you had the chemist with the sociologist with the computer science person with the marketing person, and they come at it from different perspectives. That's what leads to innovation. That's the book you got to write, Walter. So he goes off and writes it, and it's an absolutely stunning, fabulous story. And to me, it shows something that I've seen throughout my career. When you get surrounded by people who share your perspective, share your background too much, you have a self-fulfilling echo chamber that never leads to the kind of success that we want. You play it safe without knowing it, which is the dangerous part. Really interesting research study was done a few years ago. So what they did is they took two types of groups, repeated this with lots of different people. One set of people were groups with similar backgrounds, similar perspectives, all of that. And another set were groups who had different backgrounds. They were different perspectives, different ages, different ethnic backgrounds, and all of that. And they gave all these groups a challenge, a problem to solve. It happened to be a murder mystery, kind of game, but it's an engaging, fun simulation kind of thing. And they threw them in the room and had them see if they could get to the answer, right? Fascinating thing, when they came back at the end of this and interviewed the groups, so they talked to these folks over here. How was the experience? Loved it. It was a blast. It was fun. We breezed through it. It was engaging. Loved every minute of it. How confident are you that you got the right answer? Oh, dude, we nailed it. Like 10 minutes in, we're giving ourselves high fives. I mean, we just riffed off each other. I love their ideas. There was energy in the room. It was fabulous, right? And they go to this group. They ask them the same questions. It's good, but if I could be honest, there were some uncomfortable moments. I gave my answer, my thoughts on something, and she came in and sort of challenged it. I don't see it that way. There were these uncomfortable moments where we weren't all in agreement. There weren't as many high fives. How confident are you that you got the right answer? I don't know. I mean, when I first read it and engaged with it, I thought, I know this. But then he said this and she said this. I'm not so sure anymore. Here's the punchline. This group was about 20% more likely to get the right answer. To me, there's a lesson in that. There's a lesson in it's very easy to, in the pursuit of working with people you enjoy working with, which is great, working with people who share your values and a culture, which is great, to go so far in that you don't have the courage to surround yourself with people who have different perspectives and are going to challenge you. It will be less comfortable. It will be more stressful. You will be more unsure of yourself as you go through decisions. But seek this out. I think this is important when you look at employers, when you look at teams you're going to be on, when you're in hiring positions and you're hiring teams. Be conscious of this. You will have some challenges along the way. You will end up with better success. And I would also argue that you ought to be thoughtful of this as you evaluate other groups as well, not just groups you're in. Another fascinating study that was done a few years ago where they took a team of folks, a team of 4, who were presenting a business idea and pitching investors to invest in the project, okay? And they captured the transcript of the pitch and the discussion between the members on this team, talking about the project, and things like that. And they handed this out to groups of investors, business professors, things like this. And the only thing they changed in it, the script, the transaction was identical in every packet. Only thing they changed is the photographs of the 4 team members. So in one set, John, William, Malcolm, Lars looked something like this. Another set, they looked something like this. And in a third set, they looked something like this. Remember, same transcript, same exact words on the page, right? Then they asked the evaluators 2 questions. One, how much relationship conflict did you sense in the discussion, the interaction between the team members? And sort of the follow-on question, is this a project, is this a company, is this an idea that you'd be likely to invest in? Okay? It's all the same. It should all come out the same. Interesting thing is, these 2, it was thumbs up. There was no conflict. I mean, they got along well. They riffed off each other. It was all great. Yeah, I'd invest in that. This one, no. Yeah, I say every time, you hear that tone of voice and the way William phrased that question to John, there was something going on there. I'm not so comfortable with that. There's some tension there. Be conscious of this, because we're subject to those same kind of biases more often than we want to think. When you're looking at other teams, don't mistake diversity and that kind of natural tension that leads to strong outcomes, that leads us to challenge our own assumptions for the kind of harmony that we often associate with business success. So, some thoughts there. Another conventional wisdom. You know who this guy is? Tim Ferriss. The great guy, 4-hour work week, master of efficiency. And again, conventional wisdom, efficiency is a key to success. Who would argue with that? Who in this room wants to be less efficient? Certainly not me, right? I mean, I have more on my plate than I can handle right now. I would love to be more efficient. I love listening to this guy's podcast and all of that. But I have a different perspective that I constantly have to challenge myself with in just seeing what's happened in my own life, and to be honest with it, that true greatness is only achieved through the existence of major obstacles. It's just true. Let me give you one simple example from it that I think is profound to me. You know who this guy is? Keith Jarrett. Keith Jarrett is a famous jazz pianist, big in the 70s, great performer, and big in improvised jazz piano. So there's a fabulous story of early on in the 70s, it was 1972, in Munich, Germany. And Keith is this big brand. He's coming to Munich, and he's actually performing at the Munich Symphony Hall there. And the concert, the one who books the concert there, is the youngest concert promoter in all of Germany at the time. Young girl, I think she was like 17, 18 years old, right? And for her, this is like her major breakthrough. Like this is gonna make her career. She's booked the great Keith Jarrett. She's sold out the concert hall. It's gonna be fabulous. So the night of the concert, a few hours before the concert begins, rainy night in Munich, Keith shows up with his right-hand man. They walk into the concert hall. He walks up, kind of surveying, the landscape and all that, sits down at the piano and starts playing. And the piano's out of tune. There's all sorts of problems. The high notes are, tinny. The low notes you can hardly hear. It's the wrong piano. It's the wrong size. Like you can't. There won't be enough sound volume out of this piano to fill the room. Okay. So he comes back to the girl and he says, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but you violated our contract. Well, the contract says what kind of piano. This is the wrong piano. This is unplayable. I have a reputation here. There's a level of excellence I have to live up to. I can't do this concert unless you can get me the right piano." Of course, she's panicked. She's got a couple hours left. It's raining. Turns out in Munich in 72, it's not so easy to find a specific model of a grand piano in a rainstorm. So she's unsuccessful. She rushes out to the car with Keith and his right-hand guy there and says, "Look, I just beg you. I've got a tuner in here. He's tuned it. It's going to be a little bit better. But please don't destroy me. Can you please just play this for me tonight?" So you might think about yourself in that position. Everything in you says, I want to perform with excellence, right? My reputation, my career is based on that. I cannot let people down in that way. But he says, he has sympathy on her, looks at her and says, "I'll do it, but remember, I'm only doing it for you." And he tells the gentleman with him, "I want you to record this because you need an example of what a disaster sounds like to show every other concert promoter when they sign up for a contract. So I'm going to just play you just a clip from that night. Oh, guess we don't have the audio. Well, I guess the audio's not playing there, but let me just tell you the story behind it. If you ever get a chance to listen to this, you can go to YouTube and look it up. It's brilliant. So what Keith has to do to get through that night, he actually has to stand up and he's banging on the keys. He improvises the entire concert. You can actually hear him groaning during parts of the concert. This concert and that recording became not only his masterpiece of his career, it is to this day the best-selling solo piano album in history. It is the best-selling jazz piano album in history. And for the rest of his career, he never equaled the sales success of that night. So the challenge I would ask you is when we see these kind of obstacles in our careers, in our life, in our school experience, whatever it might be, every instinct, every fiber in your body is going to say what Keith did. Like, I can't risk that. I can't go down that path. This is going to be a disaster, right? And I have to challenge yourself, when you go through those and you're forced to, and it happens to succeed at the end, then you tell yourself the story that you succeeded in spite of the obstacle. And the question I just ask you is it not possible that in more of those than we're willing to admit, that you actually created greatness because of the obstacle? So my encouragement there is, don't fear that. In that pursuit of efficiency and excellence and reputation, all the things that are, I'm sure, in everybody's heart here tonight as you go out and think about what you're doing today, what you'll do in the future in your career, when these kinds of situations happen, remind yourself that sometimes it's that very thing that creates the greatness that will define your career. And I've seen this in my own career many times, and I think I think you'll see it as well. Really quickly, to wrap up here, another conventional wisdom you certainly hear in kind of some of the circles that we go through is this notion, whether stated or implied, that if you want to be a Christ follower, sort of have that ethic, that value in your life, and also be in a business setting, be in a leadership setting, that it requires this sort of sense of martyrdom. What I mean by that is that sense of, the world's out to get me, I'm a victim, people are going to hate me for that. And again, all these things have an element of truth. And there certainly are some of those things that we may have to encounter. But I've actually found something else to be more true in my life and over the course of my career, is that when you live your values out, the values that you learn from watching the way Jesus interacted with people, or the things that you see from the Word, you're going to see more often than not that it brings out the best in those around you. People respond well to it because it works. So I'd say that if there's anybody here tonight who has that sense when you're interacting with people that I have to be a certain way, I have to, have that sort of, and it comes across as being judgmental or tense or whatever. Instead, be reminded that Jesus lived his life out there with all sorts of folks, right? And he was just real. He was authentic with them. He showed them love. And when we have the courage to live that way and just forget about all the rest of it and act that way, people respond well to it, right? Doesn't mean you're not going to have problems and issues and things like that. I think in the end, you end up being far more successful in business, in financial matters, in all these things that we're looking at, not just popularity contest, when you have the courage to live that way. And then the last thing I want to do is, since Gary mentioned some of the current things I'm working on with DreamStart Labs, we don't have time tonight to go through more about what we're doing at DreamStart Labs. This is beyond crazy. It's hard to do any kind of startup when you try to doing it with in remote villages and all these sorts of things that really can't and shouldn't work. There's a ton of challenges, but our vision is to create innovative mobile technology that brings the kind of excellence that we have experienced through our careers in Silicon Valley and bring it to underserved people, specifically women, throughout the developing world. We got our first 2 products that we're working on right now. And I guess just one kind of observation I've had from that experience that I think fits into this theme that we're talking about tonight. And that is that for those of you who also aspire, or probably are doing these kind of things today, where you're investing in someone over there or someone in a different kind of life situation that you are and wanting to pour into them and help them out, coming from a sense of, of respect for them and love for them and all of that. There's a strong tendency to look out there with a perspective of, I'm going to see what's broken, I'm going to identify it, and I'm going to go fix it. And even if we don't do it out of a sense of hubris, the underlying assumption there is, I'm a little smarter than you, I see things that you don't, you're doing some things that are foolish, I'm going to go fix that. And I tell you, coming out of business, where all we do is look for problems and market gaps and try to come up with ideas and ways to fix them, it's 10x harder for those of us in the room. Or easier to fall into that trap, maybe I should say. And what I'd encourage you to do is, when you do that, especially in this kind of context, what you often end up with, more often than not, is things like this. Brilliant solutions that looked great on paper, that probably raised lots of money from fundraisers, and are sitting in landfills in developing countries because you hadn't really thought it through. And so one of the things we keep challenging ourselves to do at Dreamstart Labs is to constantly be thinking not what's broken over there that I can go fix, but flip that around. What are you doing today that is fabulously out of the park, home run successful working? And is there anything I can do to partner with you to bring things maybe you don't have to that to accelerate the success? Because you know what? You are smarter than me in that area, right? You understand your market better, and all I'm doing is I want to be a part of your success, a part of your journey, a part of your story. And I tell you, when you take that mindset, things are very different. You end up, in situations like this where you're sitting down with someone in her village, eating with her, spending time with her family, asking her what her dreams are about, and you're learning from her, and you pick up these insights, and you think, now that's something I can get behind. And then you get this wonderful opportunity to be a part of somebody else's story in a way that's way more satisfying than thinking you've come up with this clever idea that's going to go solve something that's broken for somebody else. So just an encouragement on that front for you as well. So I think we're pretty much on time, Gary, but with that, we'll bring you back up.
Thank Wes. Come on over here, Wes. I'll over here and I'll. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then make sure that students that you start thinking of your questions. All right. So where we started with the talk was here, at McAfee, and clearly there's a lot of takers there. There are not many givers. That's not the model, and that. How did you start to recognize that? How did you then, within that culture, was it in that culture, or was it the next position, the next job? Would you find yourself in that position? How do you adjust? Because career resilience is really important. We oftentimes find ourselves in situations that we say, you know what, I'm not sure that this fits me. How did you start to navigate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, first of all, I'd love to say that, I looked out at the scene around me and said, no, this is not for me, and I'm going to go make this, courageous stand. It wasn't quite that way. It was, right. First of all, I'll tell you one memory that I have, and this is, kind of funny, but I remember early on in that situation where I just felt like, man, I'm over my head. Like, this is not going to end well. And I remember, just that strength of, like, how do you get up every day and go in and face that gauntlet? And I'm a young guy at that point. So I remember writing down a verse on a 3x5 card, putting on the bathroom mirror, and every morning I'm looking at that like, this is how it's going to get me through the day. The funny thing is, to this day, I have no idea what that verse was. I can't remember it.
Can't remember which.
But it was that idea that something spoke to me, and it was basically God's, strength. And I'm saying, like, I'm not going out there today in my strength, and all the things that I'm going to fail in on my own doesn't really matter because I'm going out with Him. And then I think back on our practical level, what I noticed is times when I'd go into these meetings and I'm thinking, like, how do I survive through this? And I'm just trying to just be myself and responding, honestly, and thinking as I leave, oh, I just blew that. I wasn't a courageous leader. And I remember the first meeting I was at McAfee, where it's long conference room table. I'm across from the CEO. All the VPs in the company are there, and I'm this young guy, and I'm the first guy on the agenda, and I'm presenting to him. And my first message is, that company you just acquired, it's probably a broken technology, and I don't think it's going to succeed. I don't think that's where the market's going. Like, that's my first setting. And I remember
a real sword, like pull the sword
exactly,
off the floor,
exactly.
off the wall.
So I walk out of that meeting, and all these different VPs are coming to me like, "Oh man, like you just killed it. Like that was awesome, and like you got a big future in this company." I'm thinking like, what the heck did I do? And I guess the point of telling that is that it was more this gradual realization that I didn't necessarily have to be profound and courageous and stand up against evil or anything like that. It was just be yourself and be honest, and it stands out. People recognize it. People you don't expect recognize it. People who you would never think would respond to it come over to you and say, "That was awesome. I'm glad you had the courage to say that." Like, what did I say?
Yeah. So if you do the fast forward 2010 and you find yourself elected as a top executive in Silicon Valley, what do you think you were doing, or what was happening at that time that led people to kind of point to you? Was there something going on there, or was it just consistently kind of focusing as a giver and building teams, and it was recognizably different? Or what do you think? Why did they recognize you that year?
Yeah, great question. I don't know how self-aware I am in these kind of things, but I think one of the things that was happening there. I mean, obviously by that time I was an executive in the company, so I had the visibility, to be in that position. But I was always, every time I'm talking to people, and whether it's emails or videos or in front of people and all that, just trying to be honest with these kind of values, and it comes out in your language. You answer questions differently. I had this interesting story that happened to me. It was at Citrix, but I'm leaving the building one day. I'm on the 11th floor of the building. I'm walking out, and there's a security guard guy that I see all the time there. And I may have told you this one before there, but it was just so curious. Like the most I'd ever said to this guy was, "Hi, how are you? Have a nice day," that kind of stuff. As I'm walking out one day, he goes, "Hey, Wes, think we could meet for coffee sometime and talk about Jesus?" I'm like, where the heck did this come from? like why? And so I said, like, yeah, sure, of course. But just out of curiosity, like, I'm not wearing a shirt. I don't go around, waving banners and that kind of stuff. And what was it? And he goes, "Well, I think your admin, may have mentioned a comment to me, but," he says, "Yeah, I think I would have known. There's a way that you carry yourself that's different." And what had occurred to me is that without really even thinking about it, there must be things that I'm doing with just the fact that I am saying hi to him, that I'm giving him eye contact, that he's watching as I'm walking out and talking to various people, and that regardless of what level they are, whatever, there's a kindness or there's a way. I'm not saying this to tout me. It was more of this sort of a awareness that the lesson I left with is, boy, people are watching.
People do watch.
People are watching. They're watching things you don't even think about. And so just be conscious. Like this, not that we're ever going to do it all perfect, but the little things that you think make zero difference can lead to a conversation like that you would never expect that you'd be having. Yeah. Right?
So questions here in a minute. So you're winding up your career in Silicon Valley, decide coming back to Southern California, and that you certainly didn't need to take on the challenge of cycle of poverty, Tanzania, and that, and decide, let's do technology in a place that's a lot more challenging than North America.
Yeah. Violate every rule of startup success that I believe in. Yeah.
So what was it about? What was it about? Was that something you were working toward, like all those years, and you were thinking, when I finish this up, I really want to do this? Or what is it that led to that conviction that that's your call? That's next.
I'll tell you an interesting kind of anecdote there too. So you just asked me that in a setting here where we're all kind of mindful of that, and it's a setting. I get asked that question all the time. I mean, twice today, and I'm meeting with a potential business partner, someone we're trying to hire on, and they're hearing our story, and it's like, before we go further, I gotta ask something. Why in the world would you go do this? Like, I don't get it. And it gives you an opportunity to talk about, like, well, ultimately it comes from my faith, right? Of seeing that there's a value to giving, and that you want to play that out. It's a profound awareness that what Jesus gave to me, I should be sharing with others. So that's where it's rooted in. So there wasn't in my life this big epiphany where I went off and screw the world for 20 years and then realized that my life is short. I need to change. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was always this sense of there's going to be a chapter 2 somewhere, and I don't know what it's going to be like. I'm often reminded of the calling of Abram, and you go back and read that section, Genesis 12, and when God calls him, like he says, leave everything behind, leave all your comfort zone, right, and go to the land I'll show you. He doesn't tell him where it is, really. I mean, it's very, very general. He doesn't tell him the challenges, how long it's going to take, and all that. Abram is celebrated as a hero of faith, but if you really look at what happens, he goes to Hebron, which is well within his comfort zone, brings everything along with him that he's not supposed to bring, and stays there for years, right? And yet, in the end of the story, because he's ultimately faithful and God keeps nudging him over that line, God looks back on it, and it's like, I don't remember your sins. He says, have you considered my servant Abram, right? He's a hero of the faith. To me, that's an encouragement, and you see all the things that he failed in. And so to me, it was a little bit of that, where I always knew there was going to be a second chapter. Going to India here at Biola played a key role in that, seeing real poverty. I thought poverty was, the barrios of LA, and you get over to places like that, and you're like, it's not. And being touched for, I need to do something.
That memory stuck with you for a long time.
Yeah.
Good. What questions do we have from the students? Yes.
I'm also currently in a pretty toxic environment as when you first started, and I want to know, did you ever feel like, man, I made a huge mistake, I'm protected, and there's nothing that can touch me? Have you ever experienced something like that?
I think at the highest level, yeah. I mean, to me, that's a little bit what that verse in the bathroom mirror was about. It was sort of like that, put on the armor of God, not to be overly spiritual about it, but it's that sense of, okay, God, I don't think I ever felt like I'm invincible, protected, that I can't get fired, I can't do something stupid, I can't lose my job, I can't make a fool of myself. And I never felt that, but I did feel like, the end of the story is secure. So whatever I go through, whatever I fail at, or whatever I screw up, like God's not going to let me fall beyond where he can. He has a story and a plan for my life, even in this, that's going to be successful. And to me, it's that overall comfort where you can still feel terrified about what's going to happen that day, but feel like ultimately it doesn't matter, because if that goes wrong, what's the worst that can happen? And God still got me. If that makes sense.
Others, yes.
Do you think there's a mentality difference between facing a challenge with an obstacle and being more successful than if you hadn't faced that obstacle at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a really interesting kind of angle on that. So we think of innovation. How many of you have heard innovation described as thinking outside the box, right? Okay, that's true in a sense. But if you actually study the way innovative ideas come up, it's really more about constraints, right? You constrain somebody to something and say, okay, this is your exercise. Now come up with an answer. Like, well, wait a minute, all the things that I would typically go to are not available for me. Now I've got, it's that sort of, the mother of invention, right? When those constraints are on you. So I think to me, it's often that. So the reason that Keith Jarrett performs that masterpiece is all these things that he would go to in his comfort zone are suddenly robbed from him, and he has no choice but to perform, and it forces him outside that. So to me, that's a big part of it. And I think as a believer, there's another dimension of that, which says I'm actually forced to take all the stuff I say about faith and put in practice, because I believe that in every day we're super dependent on God, but there are certain days when you're profoundly aware of it, and there are other days when you go forward and think, I pretty much got this. I'm smart, I'm capable, I've done this before. And it's those days that are your biggest threat, right?
Yes.
Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned celebrating wins. What career risks have you taken as giving you the greatest results so far?
Which career, I'm sorry?
What career risk have you taken so far, or failures?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the what I'm trying to do now, I think is, like super likely to fail in all the conventional ways. I think the probably the biggest things as I look back on my career there is those moments of where I felt unprepared, unable, not as talented, skilled, whatever, as others around the table, and recognize that that I have a choice to either kind of step back and let someone else take a lead, or step in and say, I'll take that on. When I didn't have the title, right? When I was just a plebe, just an everybody person there, but it's like, I'm going to take that on. Now that's a risky situation, in my mind, because like I didn't have to do that, and I'm putting myself out there. I don't know what I'm doing compared to other people around the table, but what I found is that taking those risks, some of them succeeded, some of them didn't, but people are noticing, they're watching, they're saying, okay, this is someone who is okay with leadership. And when the next promotion comes around, the next interesting project comes around, they look over and they say, that woman who did that in that meeting, what about her? And it's like, and you're not even in that meeting, so you don't see that kind of context happening. But I think that's the kind of pattern I saw where, as I look back, like where I, probably took those risks. So.
Others? Yes.
Actually, a good follow-up to your response. As a giver, is there such thing as giving too much?
Yeah.
And so, how do you determine where that boundary is?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish there was a really super easy formula. If you read the book that I mentioned, there's actually, the interesting thing is you look at the bell curve, and over time, the givers dominate the high end. They also dominate the low end. And so that's a really interesting, I just showed you the one, kind of lateral example. And so why is the low end? Well, some of them it's very early on. So they're like below the curve in the beginning, and over time that equals out and they end up on the high end. But there's some of them, they're at the low end because they're allowing themselves to be pushovers and getting taken advantage of, and all the things, all the reasons that we sort of don't do that. There's a fascinating, I won't get into it too much, but there's a fascinating story, the prisoner's dilemma. You ever done that game theory? Where like two, I won't go through it all, but two people are caught in a crime, pulled into separate rooms. They're both given a choice, and they have a series of options, and it plays out differently. But it's like, if you rat the other guy out, you get this sentence. If you stay silent, you get this sentence. Basically what it comes down to is, if you're both ratting each other out, then one set of circumstances happen, and it's all a trust game, right? So it's that whole process. There's a researcher named Axelrod who actually ran a challenge asking people to write computer simulations that would play Prisoner's Dilemma in a competitive environment and see which strategy actually worked. And he got all these submissions, some of them very long, elaborate computer programs, and they would run these challenges against each other and just pit them again, like who actually wins in this. The interesting thing is the first several times they ran this, the one that won was not the one that came out and like screw the other guy over and over again. It was also not the one that came out and said, always give, always be nice, that kind of thing. It was the one that he called it tit for tat. And basically it was always be nice first. Always be nice first. Lead with that. And when the response, in spite of the being nice, is antagonistic, then put up the wall and don't let yourself be run over. That was the one that won over and over and over again, dominated the other programs. So then years later, he went back in and it's like, okay, is there any way we could improve that algorithm? This is like a 2-line program, any way we can improve that algorithm. And they actually later came up with one tweak. They tried all these different methods. One tweak that actually improved it. And it was on top of that, randomly, occasionally, be nice even when the other person responds bad, and when that badly. And when that happened, the success rate went up even further. And so to me, it's a really interesting, obviously it's just a game, simulation, but I think that's a really interesting model of sort of what I see in human behavior. It's like, you always lead with assuming the best of the other person, right? Always. People notice that because from the beginning, that's different. When somebody is reacting negatively to that, they're pushing, stand your ground, don't be pushed over, do it in a kind, polite way, right? And then occasionally, you step in and you say, even though you had ill-free intent, I'm going to do something nice. And I think you have that kind of formula. I think you'd be surprised at like stuff that happens that just kind of blows you away.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.